We're just a minute away, but we are going to get started because there is a lot to talk about today. I guess we'll be fair and give everyone the full minute to come in. I know that people generally tend to pour in around between now and 5 after, so we'll give them that chance. Alrighty, so we are going to start off the hour as we always do in the spirit of reconciliation. For those living in the Calgary area, we'd like to acknowledge that those folks are living, working, and playing on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation Region 3. And for those up in the Edmonton area on Treaty 6 territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and the Métis, we acknowledge the lands you work and play on as well. So if you're in another area of Canada or the globe today, I'll just have you share the traditional territories that you live and work and play upon. Sorry, I've got noise in the background. So we're going to head over to, for those of you who don't know, I'm Bridget Legault, the community manager at Rainforest in Calgary. We have Amber Rowden, our community storyteller, who can give a wave in the background. And our steering committee from Edmonton's Rainforest is also here. We have James and Aaron today, and I can't see everyone, but if there are others, please give a hello in the chat. If you are new, we'll have you just use the reaction button to identify yourselves, and those who have been around a little longer will be able to reach out and welcome you. Today's format is going to be a little bit different than we usually do. As most of you know, over the past, I don't know, maybe longer than maybe 8 months or so, we've been featuring founder stories through the lens of the social contract. But we're going to take a little detour today and go over some high level statistics from the Edmonton and Calgary Scorecard Assessment. And if you're unfamiliar with the scorecard, we can fill you in here in just a moment. But I'm going to pass it over to James up in Edmonton, who's going to do an intro to what the Rainforest is all about.
Hi, everyone. How are you all doing today? Hope you're having a lovely Wednesday. Today's Lunch Without Lunch, we'll move to the next slide. We give a little bit brief about what we're all about. Here's a video.
What does it take to realize an idea or for a seed to sprout? At Rainforest Alberta, we know the answer is rooted in trust. Traditionally, Albertans have cultivated their ideas in established systems. Inputs that don't fit these systems are weeded out. Opportunities for growth are missed. But now, Albertans want a dynamic landscape that can evolve organically, like a rainforest. At Rainforest Alberta, we believe a culture of trust is the fertile soil where ideas grow. Our budding innovation ecosystem is a network of relationships pulling each other up as they push forward in their own field. Trust breaks down barriers. An open, inclusive network increases collaborative innovation. Successful breakthroughs inspire new ideas. A cycle begins. Rainforest Alberta is a movement to amplify trust by cultivating honesty, inclusion, and accountability. How? Our social contract holds us accountable to demonstrate trust across the province. We meet to have honest conversations around collaboration. This leads to more inclusive spaces for everyone to fearlessly build new ideas together. By raising the standard of trust, Alberta's ideas, talent, and resources can be evergreen. Visit rainforestab.ca to sign the social contract and start growing together.
So I'd like to welcome you all. And my name is James Kiersted. I head up the steering committee for the Rainforest Initiative here in Edmonton. I am, like many of you, an entrepreneur in the tech ecosystem. My company is 11 Electronics. We're in the business of making homes more affordable to build, purchase, and operate. I've been doing this community involvement since 2016. We're very excited to be sharing our fifth scorecard today results. And the scorecard is really based on these 6 pillars that guide our conversations and actions. Not all are weighted equally. Like any ecosystem, the right balance is crucial. They are measured each year through this scorecard assessment, and today we're going to be sharing those results with you. We talk about the 6 pillars all the time: culture, leadership, resources, engaged activities, policy and infrastructure, and role models. So tips for making lunch without lunch as good as possible: introduce yourself in the chat, connect with other individuals through direct messages, put your camera on. I realize we can't all meet in person, but at least we can share each other's faces and our impressions so that we can connect a little closer. Ask questions, keep on connecting in the Rainforest Slack workspace, and check out lunch without lunch, or lunch notes, hashtag lunch notes, for a capture of today's chat. Lunch without lunch recordings are also posted on YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about, do you want to do this one, Bridget, or can I?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll just mention that each week
Perfect.
we've taken the opportunity to just highlight a particular social contract value just to keep them kind of front of mind. And so I won't read it out to you all today. I think we all have a good idea of how to pay it forward in our own ways, but this is one of the values that we've agreed to live by in the rainforest. So maybe think about ways you can pay it forward today or throughout this week. All right, we will get Amber to share the next deck. So sorry, we're crowding the screen today with a PowerPoint and can't see all your lovely faces as much, but we want to present some high-level results from both Calgary and Edmonton scorecard. So I'll just wait for Amber. She's been working hard behind the scenes on all of this. I can start just by doing a quick, we will just pull up the pillars here, which James just spoke about briefly, so we won't spend a lot of time talking about the pillars in particular, but as we many know, if you're familiar with the rainforest analogy, these are the pillars that make up the ecosystem. And so all of the scaffolding and supports that support startups and founders and entrepreneurs and those working within it, startup team members, founders, everybody. The pillars on one side more heavily weighted are culture being the most important pillar and leadership taking up 50%, the two of those. And then on the other side, we have our other 4 pillars, which we'll talk about extensively today. And so this is how they're weighted in the scorecard assessment out of a score of 1,000. And so in Calgary, we had a goal of reaching 800 by 2021, and we'll talk about if we've gotten there or not. I'm not going to read each of these definitions. I'll be honest, we've been doing some work. We've talked about this a lot if you're active in the rainforest on our scorecard assessment in Calgary. Some of these pillar definitions over time aren't necessarily fully representative of the pillar itself or aren't entirely clear for folks who are newer to the ecosystem. And so some of the wording on these pillars will change, but the essence of them will always remain the same. So we'll go to the next slide. A little bit of history for, again, those who are newer to the rainforest, and I've only been around for just over a year, so please feel free to correct me in the chat if you don't mind, in the interest of time for the beginning of this presentation.
Bridget,
but,
I noticed in the chat, sorry for interrupting,
yeah.
I noticed in the chat, Jim Gibson, one of the founders of the Rainforest here in Edmonton, is actually here, so we can pick his brain as well.
Yeah, definitely. Jim, are you, there you are, I see you in the polka dot door.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for joining us. And Brad Zumwalt, our other kind of more I guess, available, accessible co-founder of the Rainforest, Jim and Brad, who have spearheaded the work primarily over the last few years, but Brad wasn't able to join us today, unfortunately. You do generally see him around lunch without lunch periodically. But Jim, yeah, if you want to talk about maybe what the first 3 years looked like of the scorecard assessment very quickly, and then I'll just talk about the change that's taken place over the last couple of years.
Well, I think initially the scorecard was our attempt to be measurable. Was the ecosystem conversation is a difficult one when you can't see progress and you can't see movement towards a goal. And so we did the best we could at the beginning to create and find a set of measures that could be carried on year over year. And I think to some extent we've been successful in that. And everyone I've talked to appreciates the fact that we are trying to hold ourselves accountable to progress and measurable progress. And it's difficult, but I think you've done and continue to do a great job on that. So it was a very early part of our vision to be measurable and accountable.
Great. Thanks for sharing that history. And I think what I'll do maybe is we'll get right into it, and I'll talk a bit about this revamp and change you see at the end of the slide for Calgary in particular when we get to the Calgary presentation. So Edmonton, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron and James in Edmonton to talk about their results. And please feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat. We hope to have some time for breakout rooms, which we always do at Lunch Without Lunch, give people time to collide and connect. So there may be an opportunity to get into smaller groups to chat about some of these results. So we're hoping to have that time. And I'll also just throw out there, if you have any community announcements you want to share, get those ready for the last 5 minutes of the hour. Over to you, Edmonton.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aaron. I'm one of the co-chairs up in Edmonton for our steering committee, and I have been managing our communications for the last 6 years. I'm also part of an entrepreneurial venture called Painworth. We help people with bodily injury claims and personal injury claims get them settled more quickly and more fairly. Yeah, let's just dive right in. We can talk about the results. So we did our scorecard assessment this year in November, so just a couple months ago. Our score is the highest we've ever seen here in Edmonton at 712, which is a little over 50 points up since the last time we did it a year ago before that. And 122 respondents, which is a little bit down compared to last year, but we're very happy about the score. This is a good sign of progress in Edmonton. So we'll just quickly go through pillar by pillar how the scores have trended over time. This is our 6th assessment. You can see generally an upward trend in the overall scores. There was a couple of years where we had dips every now and then, but nice, roughly 10% growth in the years when we've been growing up to this just over 700 for the first time this year. Leadership, you can see, has been a little bit flat over the years, but it's again continuing to trend up. We had a little bit of a trend down in a couple of years ago, but during COVID, it's been nice to see the resurgence. James can probably talk a little bit about the ERIN and what's been going on there, which is, I think, helping some of the scores in this pillar.
Yeah, well, we have the Edmonton Regional Network, which is an innovation network, much like you have in Calgary with the Calgary Regional Innovation Network. I think that falls under the CIC. And we've been, really building that out here in Edmonton and connecting more and more with the service providers and entrepreneurs in the community. And I think it is, starting to have a bit of a payoff. We got more work to do, though.
The current version of the RIN was formed just after the November summit in 2019. I think they officially kicked off in 2020, and James is part of the governance committee over there now. So he's been spearheading some of their growth, which we're really happy to see. You can go forward, Amber. Frameworks and policies. So this is taking a big step forward this year. I think this is probably the one most directly related to the group or the work that the ERIN group has been doing, putting in supports from more of an ecosystem-wide level, the service providers and whatnot that are funded to provide supports really come together nicely. You can see resources similarly taking a step up. Oftentimes those resources are provided by government or service providers, but this does include things like access to capital. And I believe in Calgary, you've also had Startup TNT, which has been a huge boon to our community, really getting people involved in supporting early stage entrepreneurs, which has been really great. This one to me is the most surprising, I think, with COVID going on and obviously no in-person meetings, the activities engagement score continues to rise. I think that's due to things we did here. Lunch Without Lunch in particular shouted out quite a few times, and collaboration between Edmonton and Calgary increasing because of these sorts of events. So we're really happy that Rainforest is able to be part of this sort of thing. And obviously Startup TNT again with their Thursday night tradition events, really keeping people engaged and active in the community. So it's nice to see the score go up so much.
Also mention the Rainforest Connectors have been well attended as well. Those happen the second Tuesday of every month. Is it second or third Tuesday?
Third, I believe. It was yesterday.
And those are in the afternoon, 4 till 5:30. Yeah.
Yeah, and then again, similarly, small uptick with role models, nothing too gigantic, but again, we're happy to see all the scores going up pillar by pillar. And of course, the last one, the most important one, culture has consistently gone up every year. It's the only pillar in Edmonton that has never decreased. This is the one we believe Rainforest is most directly accountable for or attached to, and it's certainly nice for us to see this continuing to tick up. This is a great score for us. The radar graph is one of the ways the Rainforest score is often shown to people. I don't want to dig into it too deeply. It can be a little bit complicated to describe, but generally speaking, the way that the group that came up with this view, Rainforest Strategies, talks about it is the more circular, the more balanced all of the pillar scores are, the more innovative or the higher potential for innovation an ecosystem has, and the more collaborative that it is. So this looks very balanced. There's a little bit of unbalanced. It's not a perfect circle, but it's been trending away from more of a top-down bureaucratic sort of style into this more collaborative view according to this interpretation of the score, which is wonderful to see. So just in terms of submissions, this was a little bit of a step back from last year. We're down about 40 or 50 submissions compared to last year. But generally it's been going up since we stopped working directly with Rainforest Strategies when they were doing their summits, and just restricting the scorecard to the people that attended the summit. This is one that we've really tried to put a lot of focus on, getting more female and more people of color responding to the scorecard so that we're getting a better understanding from different perspectives of how people feel about the ecosystem, what their perceptions look like. We're nowhere close to parity, but we're slowly ticking up generally, other than a small step back last year. So lots of work to do there yet, but it's moving in the right direction, hopefully. This is another one that is really important to us. We've striven to always have 25 or at least 50% entrepreneurs who do the scorecard, and at least 50% entrepreneurs who show up to the summits to go through how we can address and move forward as an ecosystem. Unfortunately, this year is the first time we were under 50%. Well, I guess actually the last couple of years, but something that we really want to focus on is continuing to engage with entrepreneurs and making sure that we're getting their voice most loudly. Just to see in general how the scores pan out for all the different types of people in the ecosystem. So that first pillar, one of the higher scores is the ecosystem helpers. That includes all of the service providers and people that are funded by government to provide supports to entrepreneurs. The very low one there is people who are employees of entrepreneurial ventures specifically, so not the founders, but not working for nonprofits or anything like that. I think most of the other ones are fairly self-explanatory, but we see reasonably good balance across. There's some lows and some highs, but the number of people in some of these categories are also quite low compared. Again, almost 40% were entrepreneurs themselves. So another area where we obviously have a lot of work to do is not the stale male pale group. Unfortunately, only 20% or so who identified as some type of racialized minority or ethnic group. So lots of group work to do there to help grow our diversity yet in Edmonton. So just sort of a last note in Edmonton, we always look through the comments and try and interpret all of the different things that people say to come up with trends and understand if there's any commonalities between what we're hearing. We heard a lot of people talking about diversity. How can we make the ecosystem more welcoming? And how do we make entrepreneurship itself something that's more accessible to people who aren't just, people who look like me, for example. We did hear quite a bit about the leadership. That seems to be a continual complaint or concern that's raised in Edmonton. There was a lot more positivity around it this year than there has been in the past, and we're starting to see some change, as we saw with that leadership pillar. And I'm going to invite James to talk just quickly about what things are changing from that perspective.
Probably the largest change that is coming about in the leadership side with regards to the Edmonton Regional Innovation Network is we are going to be incorporating ownership linkage into our governance structure so that we are planning and executing connected discussions with the community on a regular basis, bedded right into our process. It happens currently kind of on an ad hoc basis. And I think that's why people sometimes, entrepreneurs in the community, feel like they haven't necessarily been heard. The other part of our governance structure will bring a lot more transparency to the decision-making processes for fund allocation and things like that, so that the entire community can at least see and understand why choices were made the way they were and how they were scored using proper criteria, so that it is available for everyone and open and transparent. When we build these things quickly, like we did with the ERIN, some of those things just get missed and they're not on purpose. We got lots of great volunteers that are doing spectacular work trying to help the community, but building that structure to support that transparency and therefore build trust in the community is what's next.
Thanks, James. And then the last theme that we heard was around availability and diversity of skill sets in the local talent pool. This was pretty broad. It wasn't just limited to there's not enough developers or there's not enough senior developers. There was issues with highly skilled salespeople, issues with people who have been through entrepreneurial ventures before. There just isn't enough of that talent locally, and that means there's not always enough people available to take on mentorship roles or coaching roles or to join and fill those spots within startups. So yeah, that's the high level. We don't want to go into too much detail today, but if you're curious and if you want to get involved in more of the detail when we do dive into some of these things in a lot more depth, please join us on March 24th at the summit. It'll be in Edmonton, in person, and you can buy tickets at the link here, which I will put in the chat as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Edmonton. Lots of insights there. You've definitely gone deeper than we'll be able to today, having just closed our survey recently, but lots to dig into at your summit. So that'll be exciting. We'll get right into Calgary so we have time for everything. We'll go to the next slide. So as many of you noticed, we were still in 2021 just over the last few weeks, having distributed the Calgary scorecard just in Jan and Feb. So the reason for that is kind of that first slide, looking at the evolution of the scorecard. It was really important for me in this role to understand the history of the scorecard, to identify what needed to be done based on some much feedback I had last year about the tool. And so what I learned was that Aaron mentioned it a few times. Rainforest Strategies is a consulting company from the States that used to work with the rainforest. They dove deeply into the Rainforest Analogy and helped establish the rainforest movement that we know and love in Alberta. Their assessment tool was originally created for organizations, not entire ecosystems. And so there was some of this leftover organizational language in the scorecard, which added some confusion. The other piece was that back in 2019, I'm sure many of you here today were involved with a group effort of rewriting the the index. And so what came from that was maybe, I can only assume because I wasn't there, but based on what the questions then looked like until 2021, they were a lot of kind of wordsmithing compromises. So you can see where previous questions had been squished together and create double-barreled questions. And I'm going to let our expert talk a bit more about that. So I got some feedback after lower than anticipated participation in last year's scorecard, or 2020s, I guess. And from various individuals throughout the ecosystem who said, it was long, it was a bit hard to follow, a bit confusing, definitions around leadership. As you know, in the Rainforest Analogy, we talk about big leaders and little leaders. And then you have role models, like how do you decipher all these different things, and kind of a plethora of feedback that I was receiving. So we decided to get some experts on board. And so we reached out to the community, and we were connected with well, we had already been connected, and many of you might remember from just over a year ago when we did a month of Lunch Without Lunches on diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. And Rachel Wade, a DE&I expert, spoke then, and she'll introduce herself again in a moment. And then we were also introduced to Janelle Morgan, who's a PhD candidate at the U of C. And again, I'm going to let her introduce herself and her expertise and toot her own horn a little bit. And these two experts will talk a bit about the analysis they conducted for us on our previous scorecard, and some insights into why we shifted things just enough to be a better survey design and a bit more clear in its delivery, but without compromising the pillars themselves. So Janelle, I think you're first. Do you want to talk a bit about your findings and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. It's nice to meet you. I've heard great things about Lunch Without Lunch, so it's nice to finally be here and interact in this space. But yeah, I'm Janelle. I'm a PhD student in the Industrial Organizational Psychology program at the University of Calgary. And I personally specialize in selection and recruiting, but I enjoy all the inner workings of data analysis and trying and implementing new analytical tools. So I've done web scraping, automated text analysis, machine learning to examine big data, but I've also previously done quite a bit of work in validating measures, which led me to partnering with the Rainforest community on this project. So in talking about some of the gaps within the scorecard and some of the insights that we received when we analyzed it, so in assessing the scorecard, there were a number of strengths that we identified, such as compartmentalizing questions under particular pillars to maximize our evaluation of the ecosystem. But given the need to focus the evaluation on the ecosystem, the use of community terminologies, as Bridget mentioned, may conflate respondents' evaluations of the ecosystem. And we saw some of that where in the narrative responses throughout the scorecard, persons were making reference to the rainforest community rather than the ecosystem, given the need to evaluate the ecosystem objectively and not necessarily the rainforest community. Another point was that we focused on was the preponderance of overloaded questions, where multiple things were asked within one specific context, which makes it confusing about what exactly respondents should be focusing on. And so we did our best to try and simplify some of those questions and separate them, and then try to offset the length that we might gain from that process by restructuring the survey design, so for ease of use. And then there was a big terminology. So respondents would immediately and collectively grasp the same thing, which is an assumption that sometimes are made that when respondents read your survey items, that they're all on the same page in terms of what you mean. So examples of that is with the use of diversity, where it's unclear if reference is being made to diversity of skill sets or diverse in and across different domains. And so we try to be more specific and more intentional with our use of that language. And in terms of what we get from all of these changes, by simplifying items that are overloaded with multiple ideas, we would be able to evaluate constructs such as accessibility more intentionally. And accessibility in this context refers to being able to access information and resources across the ecosystem. And this is especially important because, as I said previously, because one of the things that came up in our literature review is that the ecosystem in Canada tends to be isolated and not very collaborative, which hinders the flow of information. And that's something that we wanted to evaluate more specifically. And we would also be able to evaluate policy in a more targeted manner. So in previous iterations of the scorecard, it wasn't apparent whose policy respondents should be evaluating and for what purpose policy should be assessed. So in the current revisions, we have specified policy as being from the government, with respondents evaluating how this affects the growth of startups. So this is an important inclusion, as Canada's policies are typically evaluated as not supportive of entrepreneurship, innovation, and specifically as it relates to small businesses. But lastly, we wanted to include more intentional EDI-related questions. So in order to earn a more comprehensive insight into the current status of the ecosystem And why does that matter? It matters because there are persons who, as a function of the groups that they belong to, are unable to access equitable resources to thrive in innovation. So this research shows that accessibility to the innovation ecosystem is an important metric for the ecosystem success. So for instance, we see that immigrant activity supports the advancement of innovation and entrepreneurship, and this needs to be more intentionally addressed within the scorecard. And so these were things that we paid attention to in terms of being more intentional about how we evaluate that EDI element and how that contributes to the innovation ecosystem in Alberta. So I'll hand it over to Rachel to elaborate more on the changes made with respect to incorporating EDI more intentionally, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Janelle. I appreciate that. Some of you I have met before, so it's good to see some friendly faces in the audience. My name is Rachel Wade. I am the president and co-founder of Including You Consulting. I also, in my sort of day job, work at Parkland Corporation as the global manager of diversity and inclusion there, which spans across Canada, the US, and the Caribbean. I've been working in diversity and inclusion passionately for about the last 8 years and have looked at it from all sorts of different perspectives. So whether that's different industries like tech, health, finance, energy, et cetera, or from different perspectives as in grassroots, corporate, nonprofit, those sort of spaces as well. So I was really excited to be working with Rainforest on this and to continue some of the work also around linking previous work that Calgary's done in this space as well through organizations like Platform. And so when we took a look and leveraged a lot of the research that Janelle did and taking a look at all of that context that she just provided around the survey in general, these were some of the things that we wanted to make sure made sense as we were adding into this new space and digging in a little bit deeper into diversity and inclusion specifically. So first of all, this is the second year we're asking respondents their demographics. So this shouldn't be new to people who had responded to it last year. However, we did see a lot of new respondents this year, which was great. It's also our first year building out D&I specific questions within the sections and then also its own sections. We reviewed any diversity and inclusion related questions that were related to the individual pillars, but we also added diversity and inclusion specific section. In alignment with Platform's dedicated internal D&I survey that they did in 2020, which was encompassed through other work as well, such as focus groups and workshops. So we wanted to make sure there was alignment there so that it made sense and we could kind of look across the board and see if there were any trends. We also designed the questions specifically to align with the pillars, as I stated, to provide additional insights. So we might be asking something about leadership, but then we want to be able to splice it by demographic to say, you know, do women feel differently about this? Or is there a rabbit hole we should be looking at for people with disabilities or racialized people seeing, you know, policies a little bit differently than everybody else? So it actually, by adding that demographic data, allows us to look across the board of any category to see if there are differences that are happening in perception for individuals that belong to different groups. We also wanted to use this as an opportunity to educate and prime the ecosystem to continue this conversation. So even today, later on in this presentation, I will get into a couple of different terminologies and topics. And it's not expected that everybody, you know, walks away from this understanding that fully, but this does allow us an opportunity to educate. So even within the survey, you would have noticed that we didn't just say the word diversity. So as Janelle pointed out previously, that was a word that previously was being used to mean diversity of the way in which you interact with the ecosystem. So as a founder or an entrepreneur, et cetera. And so we're really looking to intentionally reshape that to align more with what is happening more broadly in the world. And we didn't want to make the assumption that people understood it that way. So we actually listed out what is meant by lived experience, gave people examples so that they could think through that. And we did get positive feedback about that wording in the verbatims, which was great to see. We wanted to measure gaps between awareness, perception, and desire. So I'll get into that a little bit further down the line as well with some of our data, but that is essentially looking at, you know, there's questions that are geared towards what is your awareness of diversity? What do you believe about the diversity that exists within the ecosystem, which we can then compare to the demographic data to see if that lines up or not. And then also how much passion or desire or interest you even have in this topic for the ecosystem. So that's what is meant there. And then lastly, we wanted to do an analysis of this data, which, as Bridget pointed out, you know, the survey just closed, so there'll be further analysis even beyond today that will help inform recommendations for 2022, specifically within this realm of diversity and inclusion.
Okay, sorry, just answering some messages in the chat. Thank you both, Janelle and Rachel. I'll just mention right now, but this work will be ongoing, that we've learned so much from you, and we will continue to learn so much from you as we carry forward in this process, because in Calgary, it really has just begun. We've only now looked at the data for like the last less than 24 hours. So what we are presenting to you today in true rainforest transparency is very high level, and we have not had, I personally have not had time to necessarily process it as much as I would have liked to before this presentation, but I welcome any insights that you all have, especially those with history or those who are new. Share those in the chat, or we'll have lots of time to talk about what this all means for us. So here we are with a score that has, as I mentioned earlier, we did have a goal of 800 for 2021, and we have not reached it. But I think what is especially encouraging with all of the work we've done on this is that only 17% of respondents for this survey filled it out last year. We haven't dug into how their perceptions have changed from last year to this year yet. But again, what is encouraging is that the vast majority of perspectives on this year's survey are either new to the survey or entirely new to the ecosystem. And we'll get to the slide that kind of shares more about where people fall as far as timeline in the ecosystem. But it also just shows a very a more true picture because of our sample size being larger than previously. And we did just run this data, so I'll just ask you to keep that in mind. Here is a comparison of where we've seen a small dip for the most part in all pillars, except for, I think, activity stayed right exactly the same. We'll go to the next slide, actually, Amber, that shows the numbers so people can actually see the change in numbers. So we have dipped in culture. And again, we haven't dug too deeply into all of the reasons, and we also haven't been able to go through the narrative responses, the long form responses, but just upon glancing through them, there is a ton of really important, insightful comments and information there. So we look forward to sharing that all in more detail for March. But these are what the numbers look like. We'll move ahead. No other reflections there for me, but again, please share yours in the chat. A real highlight of last year's survey was the higher score for females, seeing perceiving or rating the ecosystem at a score of 700, and that has dipped again, much larger sample size and probably a lot of other factors we have yet to uncover. But still a kind of positive and somewhat aligned score from the non-binary and gender non-conforming group, which was encouraging. And yeah, I think that's all the perceptions or the observations for this slide. We'll move ahead. We have quite a few here, so we're gonna whip through them quite quickly and get to some other conversation. So again, Rachel is going to talk a bit more about the prefer not to say category, which you'll see on all of these slides as far as how we've spliced the data by different demographics. And so there are some interesting insights I've learned about what that category, what it might mean for that category consistently rating the ecosystem lower. And yeah, again, encouraging to see that the LGBTQ2S community is, perception of the support in the ecosystem being aligned with everyone else. And a fairly large number of those who preferred not to identify their sexual orientation, which could also tell a story. So we'll get there. Next. Okay, the older generation rating the ecosystem a bit lower, and again, that prefer not to say category rating considerably lower. The younger you get, the more positive you are. I don't know, we won't make assumptions. To the next slide, please. This was interesting. For those of you who maybe entered the ecosystem or can think back to what kind of that 3-year ago mark looked like, I'd be really curious if anyone had any kind of anecdotes about what occurred for those who have been around for just over 3 years. They've perceived the ecosystem considerably lower, and a much higher score from those who have been around 6 to 18 months. My own personal observation is that I find the energy in the ecosystem is very high right now in Calgary, as we all know, and those who are newer to it, but who are getting to know it, are feeling, I hope, included and supported, and recognizing that the pillars are, you know, are substantially accessible and available to all. So we'll go to the next one. I think for myself personally, again, here is what's important. So what I guess wasn't mentioned is why the DE&I focus. And there were some comments in the survey of why do we need to talk about this so much? Yeah, I'll leave my personal thoughts out of it. But I mean, from what we know and from what the literature also shows is that diverse ecosystems do better. It's also core to the rainforest analogy. If you think about a rainforest, you know, what makes it tick? It's the diversity. And where have we been consistently like ranking low is in diversity. And so the numbers at the bottom show the number of respondents, and some folks could have chosen more than one. So it might not be perfectly, you know, there could have been, you know, less than perceived maybe by these numbers of each individual category. But for me, it's, yeah, a little, I mean, it's not shocking. We do know what the group looks like, but throughout the ecosystem, but we would have loved to see more participation from other groups. So the question becomes, how can we engage more groups and increase the diversity and therefore the, you know, accelerate innovation in Calgary? I'll go to the next one. Also interesting because Edmonton, I think you said you're a startup team member, you labeled them a different kind of title, but were low, and they seem to be a fairly high category for our group. Consistent with last year's data, students have the most optimistic view on the ecosystem. So that's great to see. Just need to get more of them involved in our coalitions at Rainforest. We'll go to the next one. And by the way, we are working on that with the universities and post-secondaries and even younger generations. Okay, so for this, again, these were new questions this year, correct, Rachel? The importance of diversity and inclusion to you as an individual, to ecosystem members, and to being essential in building a successful ecosystem. So I'll maybe turn it back over to you at this point, Rachel, if that's okay, to chat about the next few slides.
Yeah, certainly. Yes, these were new, and these weren't the only questions that we asked in the diversity and inclusion section, but there wouldn't be a year-over-year comparison for these. And I think what's really interesting to point out here is that we received a score of 8.71 as far as importance of diversity and inclusion to individual respondents who were answering the survey. And then there is a perspective that when they think about how important they think it is to the ecosystem, it drops down to 7.52. So if you're looking at those in percentages, that's like 87% importance, and then 75% when they're thinking about their peers or other people in the ecosystem, or how this is showing up as a piece of importance. And then, we go even further to ask, how important do you think it is as far as building a successful ecosystem? And that score goes back up again as far as importance. So you're seeing, an interesting kind of up, down, up on this. And I think what's important to pay attention to there is that there is an opportunity. So one, we're starting with really great momentum as far as people's attunement to diversity and inclusion and how important it is to them as individuals. And then the opportunity lies in, okay, so how do we make it show up and be intentional about creating importance for this, that it is obvious to anyone that, stumbles upon the rainforest or intentionally is here or has been here for years, that this is an important space. So I think that's what these numbers are telling. And we will be breaking these down further as we do our analysis too, to see if there are particular groups or demographics within there where this is much more important to them or much less important to them, because that will tell us different things as well, as far as how welcoming it is to different groups, or where there might be rabbit holes that we need to investigate further and find out what's going on there. The other thing too that Bridget had commented on previously was around this prefer not to say category, which I just want to say is absolutely acceptable to not provide data. So this isn't meant to be a judgment space, but it is a curiosity, I think, around why do people sometimes choose not to say. And so there were spaces in there, so that 9.8%, for example, was around sexual orientation. So, and I know there was a comment in the chat previously kind of wondering, like, why does that even matter? And so there's a couple of different things that are worth thinking about when we talk about why someone might choose prefer not to say. In a survey, a diversity inclusion survey that's actually completely anonymous, Sometimes it can be they're protecting their anonymity so that they feel like they can be more honest on other questions, because there can be sort of paranoia or feelings of like, well, maybe someone will drill this down and figure out that was me that said that culture isn't great, for example. In this case, that's not really relevant because it's confidential, but not anonymous. Emails were attached to it. So for any answer in a confidential manner, obviously, that could be identified potentially. But there are still two other explanations that often come up. One is around psychological safety. So psychological safety, and you can see there in the definition, is a concept that was developed specifically by Amy Edmondson from the Harvard Behavioral, and she's a Harvard behavioral scientist. And her high level definition is, it's a shared belief held by members of a team, or in this case, community, that the community is safe for interpersonal risk taking. And so what that means is that you know that you can put your hand up and say something isn't right, or you can put your hand up and say, I have a really wacky idea and I want to share it. And that is where things like innovation come forward. It's also where we get the golden nugget of diversity of thought, which is that different perspectives can come together, can be appreciated, can be elevated, can be sifted through. And that's where you get people outperforming competitors when their more diverse mindsets are at the table. But that is sort of like the diversity and inclusion. So if you just have diversity but not inclusion, that's where you're losing out on your psychological safety. So people are showing up, but they might be homogenizing themselves to the group. So I could be a woman that feels like I have to put my man pants on to show up. So I'm leaving different parts of myself behind. What also that means, if like, let's use the LGBTQ2S perspective as an example, because that was brought up in the chat. If I have to continually compartmentalize a major part of my identity and who I am and how I show up at home or any other space, I am, for one, actually, and this has been tested, actually constantly distracted. So I'm having to constantly think about not sharing who my partner is, not sharing who I went on vacation with, maybe not sharing what types of things I do in my spare time or activities I take part in, because I feel like this isn't a psychologically safe space where that will be well received. And so instead of focusing on that, or maybe bringing some perspectives from that subculture that I also exist within, I'm constantly compartmentalizing and constantly distracted. So these things have been researched to show the links between those pieces. So you really lose out on diversity of thought when people feel like they have to leave a part of themselves at home or hide a certain part of themselves. And that can include, even when it is visible, like you're a racialized individual and you have to do what's called code switching. So suddenly you're showing up, you're speaking a different way, you're maybe dressing a different way to fit in with the majority of that population. It can happen for women, it can happen with people with invisible disabilities that people don't realize exist. And so they're struggling day to day because they don't feel like they can tell somebody that they need help or that they're showing up, that they actually have this other element in their life that's really important. So that's that psychological safety piece. I know that's a bit of a whirlwind through that. It's a big concept. There's lots of videos and things out there that you can explore as well. And I love to chat about those topics. So feel free to poke me later about that. But the other piece too that we saw show up in comments, especially, was minimization. And so this is this idea where we sort of zero in and look for sameness. Very common. This is sort of a kind of well-researched and adapted scale from denial to adaptation. Most Canadians and most populations on the U curve are going to fall within minimization. And that is sort of looking at things like the golden rule, treat others as you'd like to be treated. Lots of us have been raised with that analogy or similar types of messages. And in diversity and inclusion, we like to shift that mentality to the platinum rule, which is actually treat others how they need to be treated. And so instead of looking constantly for sameness, which again is a very common attribute, especially if you're at a party and you're looking for ways to connect with somebody else, it's actually about appreciating the differences, understanding what they bring to the table, but also appreciating that there could be different challenges that different people face or different perspectives that they can bring to solve a solution or be more innovative. So minimization is another reason that sometimes people will prefer not to say, because they actually just don't see the purpose of identifying different elements of their identity.
Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. Okay. Yeah, that's a lot. And like I mentioned, we did last year spend a month just learning about DEI. Courtney Brannigan, previous community manager, had ran a survey about a year and a half ago that kind of, I guess, sparked this work. But obviously this work is happening, like Rachel said, all over the world. The world is shifting, the world is changing. But when we brought the work we were doing on the scorecard to Brad and Jim, co-founders of the Rainforest, they reminded us that diversity was the #1 social contract value, and it was #1 for a reason. And so it really is core to our work. And then when Janelle started doing her analysis and found that there was all of these kind of random questions amongst all the pillars that were loading onto this unidentified factor, which was, when you looked at them, all related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So these are really important conversations to have, and new terms and ways of thinking to learn about. And so Rainforest does hope to champion some of this work. What's next for us? Edmonton talked about their summit coming up. Because the scorecard work was delayed to late last year into this year, our focus has been entirely on scorecard, quite frankly. What happens next, we want to do intentionally, not just to have a summit. And so we will be doing that. And there are other partners in, as James mentioned, the Calgary Innovation Coalition, which for those of you who don't know, is like now up to 45, 50 members of folks supporting the ecosystem. The CIC has funding from Alberta Innovates on their upcoming contract to specifically address more DE&I learning. Rainforest has funding through the CIC platform. As I mentioned, the chat is doing work on this, as are other organizations. And so it's important for us to align this work with other partners in the ecosystem and not just ignore it, like really dig in and get to work here. So on that, and the pillars themselves, they've obviously all seen a dip. And so, as I mentioned, we will dig deeper into the comments and maybe why those dips happened. I do have like a really strong hunch that it is just this bigger sample set and the newcomers to the survey, which is really encouraging to see. The number of founders that filled out the survey this year is higher, and that is very encouraging to see, because it is them who you know, it's those companies that we're really supporting and trying to grow. So that is enough. We could do a really, or actually, why don't we do questions, because there's not quite enough time to go into breakout rooms, unfortunately. If anyone would like to unmute and ask a question in an orderly fashion, we can take a couple of questions before community announcement.
But a lot of the questions, the words changed, and the perception of what was being asked changed. So one of the things you need to consider, I think, is that you're not comparing apples to oranges. And I think you are in a mild sense, not totally. And therefore, you can't just say it went down. I mean, it's different questions, different scorecard.
Yeah, I'll maybe let the experts speak to that. But how I see it, Gary, is that the data is now more accurate and more valuable, because we don't have a question asking, for instance, one of the questions used to be, is the ecosystem inclusive, welcoming, and diverse? Well, those are three very different things all being asked in the same question. So how is, you know, that measurement isn't, what is it measuring? But Janelle, I don't know if you want to comment on it.
No, I think you captured it really well, Bridget. We made a lot of changes that I think reflects how people actually feel about the ecosystem. And we've also tried to maintain the actual content of the previous scorecard as well. So if the previous scorecard discussed diversity, equity, and inclusion, we also made sure that those elements were accounted for in the current scorecard. It's just that what we're measuring is a bit more specific and tailored to the actual goal, and not so much conflated with other things going on as well. So in terms of making a fair comparison, I mean, there are other different elements that come into that as well, like, you know, the improvements of the scorecard. But we also could make a leap and say that we're getting an accurate reflection, and we have to kind of qualify those statements with that as well. But yeah, you captured it really well, Bridget.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying, Gary, and I definitely, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and that was our hesitation as well. But I was also getting feedback, to be like fully transparent, I was getting feedback that it wasn't an effective tool, and from some leaders who have kind of education and academic experience and research, who said, you know, I'm not bought in, sorry, this isn't a good survey. And that also, you know, kind of spurred on this work. But as much as possible, we were really, really thoughtful and intentional about trying to stay, and quite often the questions ended up being more aligned with the original versions of the questions from 2016, 17, whatever, because it was over the years, they had all been squished together in different formations. So I would say that, like, yeah, it would be interesting to look at like 2016 to now. There's so many ways we could slice the information, but.
I do agree that it's a much better survey. A lot of the questions were, you know, I might interpret them to the left and you would interpret them to the right, so you get different answers.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's always been like that, yeah, it was a bit subjective, but I actually am surprised that, and I've had people come back to Calgary that have been away for a while, moving their families back here, and they're just amazed at how much more entrepreneurial the province has become. And they don't think this survey is reflecting that. And I'm not quite sure why, but I know we're just looking at it. And then the other thing, it would be interesting to see how this might match with more tangible things like jobs created, companies started, financings that occurred, trainings that occurred for entrepreneurs, mentor matchings that happened, those kinds of things. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I totally agree, Peter. Like, we all know what it feels like to be in the ecosystem right now, as far as like the momentum and the movement forward. I'm really looking forward to digging into a lot of the comments a little more, because while I feel that way, it was obvious in the comments that not everyone feels that way. So yeah, we can often just be, for those like yourself, Peter, who've been around, this is again, Bridget's perception, not worth much, but if you've been around for a very long time and you've seen this growth over growth and momentum from beginning to end sort of thing, that's a whole different view than, say, you know, like I remember Ross, I don't know if Ross is here today, but I remember when he told me the story of when the scorecard was thrown in front of him. Are you here, Ross?
Yeah, I'm here hiding in the background.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember that conversation, but you told me about when the scorecard was presented to you and you were new to the ecosystem.
Yeah, I was just coming into the ecosystem. It was an event and they gave it to me on an iPad and I just had no idea about it. And I didn't realize like it was just the rainforest ecosystem. I thought it was like the whole startup ecosystem across the board.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was interesting kind of getting thrown into that as my first experience with Rainforest.
Yeah. We'll need a couple minutes for community announcements, but V and James.
I'll just add on to Ross's comments. I wasn't sure which perspective, what role I played in the ecosystem to answer the questions correctly. So I struggle with that. It sounds like other people did.
I'll add a couple of points real quick. One is I do believe the fact that you have so many new respondents year over year would definitely impact it, because you don't get that year over year interpretation. So I don't think it should be seen as a negative. The fact that you did change answers does also make, or questions, does also make it more difficult to compare. I mean, we went through the same thing. We adjusted ours, what, 2 or 3 years ago, Aaron? And
Per year. There's always small tweaks.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to bringing that closer and closer to so that Calgary and Edmonton's survey are identical. And the last comment I wanted to make is on diversity and inclusion, and just why it's so important. For those who've read the book, you know, rainforests produce these unique species because it is an open and inclusive environment where all can come in and join. And if that doesn't exist, we end up becoming very homogenistic, and that's the big risk. And the most common thing that happens is people just don't participate if they don't feel like they have trust that there is psychological safety in the ecosystem. So that's why I personally feel that it is so important.
Yeah, and that culture pillar is where, as rainforesters, we really play and promote and advocate for. So thanks for that, James. I know this is a huge loaded topic and we just threw a lot at everyone, and even ourselves, I think, are feeling a little overwhelmed with all of the data, but we'll continue the conversation. We have another date in March that's not booked for Lunch Without Lunch. Otherwise, we're booked till like May at this point. But we'll hold that open for maybe continuing the talk or the conversation in smaller rooms so everyone can have a voice. Are there any community announcements before people have to hop on?
I don't have an announcement, but Bridget, or you might have said this and I might not have been paying attention. Are we able to access this report so we can go through it ourselves?
Yeah, so next steps, because we just got into our data in YYC. So for Calgary's next steps is to work with Janelle and Rachel further for a process, like Al mentioned in the chat. Let's not keep changing this. There were a few more tweaks we probably could have made if we had had more time, but the process moving forward now, we want it to remain as consistent as possible. So we're going to be working on that process and on how to distribute the data. We'd like to produce a more robust report for everybody that splices all of this information a bit better to provide better insights, and then it will be distributed in probably end of March.
And I do have an announcement. For those who don't know me, I kind of dropped off the face of the earth with Lunch Without Lunch for a few years during COVID. I'm working with a company called Mission X, and we are a platform that allows companies to run just their business off of. I don't want to get too far into it, but we would like to be able to work with them with startups in the area and provide our services for no cost as people are starting to ramp up. So if you guys are looking to start up a company, looking at how to keep your stuff organized, please feel free to connect with me. I'd be happy to contact with you guys.
Thanks, Steve. It is the top of the hour. We can still take more announcements, but I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming today to learn about the results. Thank you to James and Aaron and the whole crew in Edmonton, and to Rachel.
Thank you,
Janelle
everyone.
For all the work thus far. And Amber has done a lot of work in the background that she's not getting recognized for. Thank you, Amber.
So
any other announcements?
I got a quick one. It's somewhat personal, I guess. My iGuard Fire, which is a stove fire prevention. First, we've crossed the 1 million mark of preventing possible stove fires. And yesterday, we got picked as the best new product in the retirement community, the American Retired Persons Association, for the year 22. And that's going out to 3 million people. So that's an Alberta company for you. Took 5 years, boys. It took 5 years.
Congrats to your team, Gary. That's awesome.
That's the rule of pi, Gary. Everything takes 3.14 times longer and costs 3.14 times more than you think.
And then you can double that when you're done.
No, he cut off there. Alan, it was part of the main survey, just so you answer your question there that you DM me. So you may have checked out early or not. We actually had 218 people try the survey and not get through the whole thing. So it's another maybe thing to look into is why they didn't finish. But I did get, a few people did tell me, oh, I'm too new. I didn't feel like I had good, good, whatever, enough data to make a informed.
I will say making the people answer the survey was better when I was trying to get into an event and had to fill it out before getting in with that.
Yeah, like in person.
Yep.
Force you before you enter.
Yeah,
Well,
no, it felt like check-ins at the door.
Well, Amber and I felt like we were probably going to lose a few friends with how pushy we were getting there, but we really wanted to see improved participation, because if it's the same people, I guess the ecosystem's growing. So let's represent that. Yeah, I'll say that. Thanks, Lillian. Good to see you again. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, Janelle.